Okay, so we're from Critical Media Lab at the University of Waterloo, and we have Matt, Phil, what's your name again?
I'm Andy.
Sorry, Andy, Phil, Matt, Julie, and Jason. And they're going to introduce themselves and talk about their projects. But we decided to do something on digital rituals. Digital rituals is kind of an outcropping of some courses I've taught and a book that I'm working on, a bunch of other projects I'm working on the topic of digital abstinence, which I'll get to later. So I'm just giving a very brief introduction to this topic, a very micro introduction, and I have a couple quotes here for you. I like to call this the Ronald Grimes bicycle quote, because Ron Grimes, who is the editor of the Journal of Ritual Studies for many years, actually who lives in Waterloo, I have coffee with him on a regular basis, he likes to think of defining ritual in terms of building a bicycle. And he says, borrow or invent a definition, and imperfect as it is, work with it. Figure out what it facilitates and inhibits, repair it if you can, and keep on pedaling. If that doesn't work, trade in on a new model. So I like this idea of defining a ritual as kind of a rickety homemade bike that you make yourself. It's a very uninhibited model of engaging with ritual studies. And that's what he wants, is for people to kind of push the boundaries of what ritual might be. But then in this book, he gets pushed himself to define ritual by his own students. And he says, okay, fine, I'll give you a definition, but don't quote it, so I'm going to quote it. Ritual is embodied, condensed, and prescribed enactment. So that's a really bare bones, stripped down understanding of ritual. So I have a couple other quotes here that I picked out myself based on really when I'm thinking of ritual, I like to focus on these two definitions. So this one's from Barry Stevenson. Ritual is a very different way of framing attention, or ritual is a different way of framing attention between what one is doing and what one is thinking or feeling. So there's something about embodied inaction and thoughts and affect here, and the relationship between those, and how ritual engages that relationship differently than other kinds of activities engage that relationship between the head and the hands. And then from Jonathan Z. Smith, ritual is first and foremost a mode of paying attention. And I think you can see where we're going here with media theory, all the focus on attention of late. Seen some of that already, we're going to see more of that. And then one more little bit here that we've been working with quite a bit in the lab is the idea of counter-ritual. So ritualists can perform against, taking issue with, or providing alternatives to rituals that exclude them and values they cherish. So if you think of software and hardware designers as essentially developing rituals for us that we carry around in our pockets, it might be a good idea to think about counter-rituals. And I think a lot of you are actually doing that in what you're doing with the work you're showing us at this conference. So the work that we're going to be showing you is done in Critical Media Lab. We're off campus in Kitchener, Ontario, in a building that actually houses a tech incubator as well. We don't have that big giant sign on the building. I just put that in because, yeah, how you like that, huh? I wonder what the mayor thinks of that. That's badass, O'Gorman. Inside the building, we run our master's program in experimental digital media, which is actually part of the English department. So you're looking upon mostly English students. There's one oddball here. He'll tell you about himself. And then so students do stuff in the lab and make stuff. I just threw these slides in because of the previous presentation on cabs and pinball machines. I had students make these cabs of curiosity in 2000, I think it was 12 or something. It was a while ago, but I found these flat packs, IKEA pack cabs the guy had in a warehouse with no instructions, and I brought them to the lab, and I had students make them, English students working with hammers and screwdrivers, make these cabs. And they basically just use X-Arcade controls to wire them together. And one group of students made this cab called Please Insert. And it's a game where you press play, and there are two coin slots, and nothing happens until you go to, you put your coin in. Nothing happens until you go to get your coin out, and you start scoring points. So actually, the game is played by inserting your fingers in the coin slot as many times quickly as you can in 60 seconds. And the students, there was a group of female students who did this actually as a commentary on the very sorts of things that you were presenting in your talk today. So we like to think of what we do. I don't use this term much anymore, but applied media theory, it's how I described it in my book, Necromedia, but it's this combination of reading stuff, making stuff that reflects on those readings, and then writing about it, and thinking happens somewhere in there, I hope, somewhere in that nexus. And that's how I organized my book, recent book, Necromedia. So there's a chapter in each book, there's a theory chapter, in this book, a theory chapter, then a chapter that describes a project, and a theory chapter, then a project about those theories, et cetera. So it's a way of working that's iterative and make-oriented. And I like to think in terms not of paying attention, which basically brings to mind some kind of financial transaction, but the French term faites attention, which is described directly as make attention, but can also mean be careful. So the idea of making attention is a deliberate sort of act of attention formation, as opposed to just attention as a form of transaction.
Okay, so what are you looking at? You are looking at what is the centerpiece of my talk, and it's about the age of progress, which is discourses of vigor in physical culture at the end of the Victorian era. So what you're looking at specifically here is a Arduino attached to an LED, which is also attached to an accelerometer. And so the idea is that every time I lower my arm and bring it back up, it counts 1 rep. And it also, as you can see here, is attached to a disassembled shock pen. So every time I do 1 rep, it delivers a mild electrical shock. And you might be wondering, why would I do this? What's going on here? Well, I'm going to explain to you what I'm getting at here. I assure you there is a method to what I'm talking about. So I got the idea from this guy, and his name is William Bankier, a.k.a. Apollo, also known as the Scottish Hercules, lots of names for these people. And so he writes a book in 1900 called Ideal Physical Culture. And he has this interesting passage in the book, and it's 1 chapter, and the whole chapter takes up 2 pages. I mean, this is the style of the book. And he talks about his great faith in electricity. Oh, sorry, I'm not using the mic. Talks about his great faith in electricity for keeping the muscles in condition, especially after any hard work, when I find it acts as a soothing tonic, same thing that Coca-Cola was back in the day. And so he says, I've invented what I call a muscle developer, which is useful to anyone who really wishes to go in for the sole object of building up muscle. And then he talks about all the magical cure-all properties of this electrotherapy. And he briefly describes its combination of electricity and light dumbbell exercise at the same time. And he talks about it's great, how it works so well. I have fully protected and patented this, and the machine will shortly be procurable at a low price. And so I thought, okay, what was this thing? Did it actually exist? Did he actually build it? Well, so that's the first edition. In the 4th edition, he comes down here and he says, in reply to the many inquiries from all over the world respecting my electrical developer, I here inform future applicants that I have decided not to put it on the market. So maybe he never actually built it. Maybe it's just some fanciful creation that he's imagined. But I thought, okay, what could this thing actually have been at the time? Maybe he was using something and he kind of exaggerated what he actually did here. So the idea of, there's some clues in the text, and he says he finds it especially as a soothing tonic. Now, electricity is many things to many people, but very seldom and for few is it ever actually soothing. So maybe that's a clue that he was using these galvanic electric belts. So this one is actually from later. It's a 1915 model, but it's based on stuff that was being used by electrotherapists, notably a doctor named Pulvermacher, as early as 1853. Was even featured in The Lancet at the time. And it was basically just copper and zinc cells that relied on the body's own natural current to stimulate current. So I don't really think it was shocking all that much. And at various times throughout this period, you have frequently people saying it's just medical quackery and it doesn't actually work. So, no shocks. Where's the fun in that? So what I did is, well, here's some more belts. So there's, electricity is life and all these interesting things. This one is perhaps more on the mark. It actually shows the use of some batteries, and it's there, copper plates and zinc plates and all these things. So I'm estimating it's maybe 6 volts. The one I'm using on my arm here is 3.7 volts, so not quite as powerful. The one thing that is really striking about all of these belts and all of these electrotherapies is the kind of discourse that gets played into them. You know, the idea of what you can see right here, which is from, where is this one from? It's an 1899 ad in the New York Journal. And it makes itself quite clear at the very beginning. You know, it's about weak men. And so the idea is that there was you know, a symptomatic problem of the age, which is that degeneracy, right? And that men especially were becoming weaker and less vitalized. And so men were using any technology at their disposal that they could to sort of reinvigorate themselves. And so from the ad, you have this doctor who's saying, I have cured permanently thousands of men, you know, women don't even factor into this, who were weak from effects of youthful folly or later excesses. And they're talking about the sin of self-pollution here. And you wear it all night. It sends a pleasant strengthening current through weakened parts while you sleep. And the idea is that the current from the batteries, which I don't think actually work, are draining into your body and reinvigorating you. So electricity was offered by different practitioners as any number of cure-alls. Hardly unsurprisingly, it was even used to cure erectile dysfunction. And advertisements at the period were calling that a loss of erectile power. So there's this association between weakness and power and virility that gets played through. And maybe they were using electrical belts too. Maybe this is what Bankier was doing. Who knows? You know, he's very skeptical and critical about the whole thing. So Carolyn Thomas de la Pena explains that whatever their actual medicinal value, the psychological utility of electric belts was that they, quote, helped primarily male consumers understand technology as the means by which their bodies could achieve the physical power necessary to meet the modern era's public and private physical demands. So technology was in this era conscripted and subsumed within this overarching myth of scientific, read male, progress, whereby bodies were assimilable to the mechanistic causes and amenable to deterministic narratives of technical perfectibility. And the muscle developer is itself a sort of prime site of that, right? It's using this electricity in conjunction with light dumbbell exercise to actually build a muscular frame, which makes you a muscular body and therefore a man at this point. And you know, this ad for me, I think, is kind of to the point. So if you're no longer weak, then you are somehow more of a man. So we have some more uses of electricity here, and you could probably write a whole dissertation on this one ad from 1904. And it's really, I think it's kind of hitting all of these wonderful points that are, you know, a sure cure for gonorrhea, syphilis cured, you know, single men. The one I want to focus on there is the electric manhood protector, which is, you know, as the ad says, single men and boys, don't ruin your manhood by secret habits. Again, it's all back to the masturbation. Masturbation is a wasting effect. My new patented, it's always patented, and it's always a new electrical technological development. Electric manhood protector makes it possible, a sure habit breaker. So here we have a, you know, digital chastity belt. Permanently cures lost vitality, weakening drains, varicocele, etc. This little invention is a godsend to men and boys. No drugs, no belt. Okay, so maybe he's not using a belt. No COD fraud, book-free in plain sealed envelope, you know, because it might be a little embarrassing to know that you actually don't have the power that you claim to have. And another thing that's coming out of all this is that the book itself is 300 pages roughly, dedicated to attacking another bodybuilder at the time, Eugene Sandow. And the thing that goes into all of this is looking at Sandow's form, looking at Sandow's capacities as a man, and basically saying, well, he's not all that strong. And so he goes into these like bizarre numerologies of all the things that Sandow can and can't do. He goes into you know, the scrutiny of his body and saying all the measurements here, like, okay, here's, you know, this is I've quoted this from the book. The measurements he gives are pure imagination on his part, and I defy him to prove them. And he shows that he's been following this Sandow character quite extensively. He's got, you know, down to the size of the wrist. It's quite extreme. So that's where I think the screen for me kind of comes in. It's part of this larger discourse emerging at the time that is obsessed with measuring, quantifying, and understanding the body at this time, because if we think about it, the end of the 19th century is also the birth of the questionnaire, right? And this is also when you have Francis Galton in 1874, and he's developing this new science of eugenics, which is all about measuring and understanding the body in these terms. So this is McFadden. He is a disciple of Sandow, who's being attacked by Bankier. And he has this magazine called Physical Culture. Sandow also has a magazine called Physical Culture. So Bankier's ideal physical culture is a kind of negation of all of the sort of practices that these people are practicing. And here you can see the body is sort of divided up into these sections that you were intended to measure, to keep measurements of, and then you would send this card away and they would give you a certified instruction program to specifically target areas of the body that you could then build, because you had to build muscle and you had to build it in the right spots and in the right dimensions and capacities. That's one of the things that Bankier is talking about when he's dismissing Sandow, as he says, Sandow's not a real man because his chest is too broad and his calves are too weak and the aesthetics of his body are all wrong. It's wonderfully queer. I love it. And you get some interesting results that emerge. So this is also in McFadden's Physical Culture magazine. And it's the sort of one of the results, the fruits of the progress, right? The progress, if you will. And so here you have the original, height, 5'9". Surprisingly, he grew 1/8 of an inch from this wonderful exercise, and somehow gained 30 pounds of just pure mass. One wonders if he was using an electrical developer at the same time. That's really all I have time for right now. Thank you.
So I'm going to be presenting on material melancholies, smartphone anxiety, and a lover's discourse. I'm a recent graduate from the master's program in experimental digital media from the Critical Media Lab, and this is part of my final master's research project. Like Jason's armband, electrical armband, it is in part speculative design, but it also comes from a sort of speculative theory that I've developed throughout with a lot of influence from Roland Barthes' The Lover's Discourse. So I'm presenting this artifact, this pillow, this augmented, not really smart pillow, but more technological pillow called Sleep Mode. It's an artifact that was produced, like I said, from this speculative theory, and it aims to parody our intimate relationship with smartphone technology by presenting in part what I believe is actually a very real use value for people who, well, most of us who display these behaviors of smartphone attachment, and in this case, particularly taking one's phone to bed. So I'm attempting to solve, but not solve, this problem. And so, Andy, if you don't mind demonstrating. So the pillow itself resembles something that you'd find in a hospital bed. Inside, however, it's been fitted with an Arduino microcontroller, a fan favorite at the Critical Media Lab. And it has an LED strip of individually addressable lights, an MP3 shield. I don't know if you can hear the beating heart right now. It's not being picked up over microphone very easily, but Andy sure can. And it also has this force sensor. So you may have noticed that the exterior of the pillow has been outfitted with the same polyester pouch that a lot of you are holding in your hands right now. This pouch is called a Yonder, and it's a magnetically locking pocket for your phone. It's recently gained a lot of traction amongst celebrities and entertainers like Chris Rock, Jack White, Alicia Keys, Guns N' Roses, many more. These entertainers have adopted the product as a means to mandate the accessory for their audiences to control intellectual and creative property, but also to promote a certain sorts of presence and being in the here and now while they're performing. So, along with Yonder, Sleep Mode also integrates a second product. This one is more of a prototype product, but it's called Pillow Talk by Little Riot. And it is this sort of like Bluetooth wristband that measures your heartbeat and sends it to your long-distance partner through their phone, which talks to the speaker that you put under your pillow so you can hear each other's heartbeats while you're asleep, but you're like across the country from each other. So the idea is to try to keep these people in intimate or loving relationships sort of connected even across distance, even across devices, through this sort of augmented sense of closeness and intimacy. So that's kind of where this pillow sleep mode is coming from. It's this product that becomes of two minds. It has this sort of overwhelming, beating heart that invokes anxiety, but it's also at the same time trying to parody this sense of comfort and gratification that you might feel, while also touching on this melancholy of being absented or away from the loved object. And so it suggests instead of putting your phone under your pillow, putting your phone away from you, to not have it with you emotionally while you sleep, to kind of distance yourself, but to put it in a caring, devoted, dedicated place, so you are able to know that your phone is safe while you're sleeping, even though you're emotionally distancing yourself from it. So in that sense, then, sleep mode is a cheeky response to the acts of affection and intimacy shown by a user towards their smartphone. But it sort of plays on these literal notions of sleeping with one's phone or taking one's phone to bed, which are common and ritualized behaviors amongst many smartphone users that flirt with this language of sexual innuendo. So this project comes from the adoption and adaptation of literary critic Roland Barthes, as I had mentioned, particularly his work A Lover's Discourse. And this work reads as a discursive glossary for the language of and the experience of what he calls this figure of the lover. Barthes' terms describe in part this sort of material melancholy as experienced by the lover. And these material melancholies I have adopted for smartphone use are explored through sleep mode in 4 figurations that I've taken from about 80 of Barthes' entire sort of glossary of terms. I've taken 4 of those and adapted them for this lover's experience, smartphone lover, tech lover's experience in sleep mode. And these figurations present themselves as a self-narrative and describe the lover as his imagined self, not necessarily his accurate or objective self, but his subjective self. So the 4 figures are waiting, dependency, agony and anxiety, which are conflated by Barthes, and the final is absence. So waiting is the experience of anticipation for the next point of contact with the loved object. Barthes figures waiting as an act of waiting for a telephone call. It's an extended metaphor throughout the entire work. And it is this idea of the return to the loved object. It's equally marked with torment and ecstasy upon the fulfillment of this sort of promised return or promised telephone call. The telephone call is not that far off from the promise of waiting for a smartphone user, and this is explored in Sherry Turkle's work, which she exchanges with teenagers in her book Alone Together. She asks them when they will be interrupted next, and the teenagers respond, "We are waiting to be interrupted right now as we're talking to you." So, of course, smartphone users are, in a sense, constantly waiting for this moment of interruption. So, these feelings have been found to persist even when the mobile devices are in their off mode. Users do feel distracted by their presence. The second figuration, dependency, is in its Barthesian figuration, one that most closely resembles what some scholars have called smartphone addiction. And it's marked by, at least for Barthes, it's marked by this subjugation or vassalage to the loved object. So Barthes' figure of the lover willingly subjugates himself to the cause of the loved one, subjugates himself to the telephone waiting for the call. So whether users, particularly adolescent ones, experience this kind of true addiction to their smartphone is a contentious subject. Dana Boyd has called this sensationalist rhetoric. Regardless, there are studies in behavioral psychology that have measured as little as symptoms of like minor anxiety to severe anxiety to these negative implications on executive functioning, such as working memory, when young smartphone users have their devices taken away. So there is a case to be made for the negative effects of smartphone dependency, especially on youth. Agony and anxiety is this figuration that has been presented by Barthes in this sort of narrative of pathology. So Barthes speaks of this paranoid lover who fears this inevitable mourning of a loved object. But for him, the fear is already posthumous because Barthes suggests that the lover is bound to mourn for the loved object as soon as he experiences and is past that moment of first ravishment. So it's easy to translate this for the smartphone user as sort of this moment passing this first infatuation with this new device. And for the smartphone user, anxiety is certainly part and parcel with this perpetual digital connectedness. So I've already overviewed briefly the presence and the effects of anxiety amongst the more attached smartphone users who have their devices taken away. But in terms of the moments following first ravishment of the lover's high diminishes after this sort of unboxing of a new smartphone, and instant gratification can be found in subsequent rewards that are repetitive and replicable, just likes, notifications, and the rest. And the final figuration, absence, is the one that's explored most closely with sleep mode. It is, of course, marked by this moment of inevitable loss. It is the consequence of the other. The lover is object, the loved other is an object, and as such is susceptible to departure. So in a society of normalized persistent smartphone use, absence of one's device is uncommon. We all have them on us right now, whether or not they're locked away. And also uninvited. The absence of a device strikes up this melancholy brought on by waiting, dependency, anxiety, all of the above, as experienced by smartphone users. And it is this melancholy of absence that sleep mode cheekily aims to appease with its yonder pouch and its LED-enhanced heartbeats. Sleep mode augments a pre-existing digital ritual that finds smartphone attachment and persistent connectivity at its core, that is, taking one's phone to bed. It proposes instead a dedicated space for this digital ritual to happen in. By inviting users to lock their phones in their pillow, they rest on sleep mode, and by inviting users to lock their phones in a pillow that they rest on, sleep mode then asks smartphone users to emotionally distance themselves from this very personal possession while still maintaining physical proximity, much like the yonder cases that you're holding right now, doing the same work. So the user waits for the return of their loved object, and in exchange for participating in this Barthesian absence and waiting, the pillow cheekily promises the return of this telephone call, this reminder of presence through its glowing lights and electronic beating heart. In all, the sound is bass-heavy and it's eerie, the lights are distracting and persistent, the promise is comfort, a safe place dedicated to holding your device, but the reality is an exaggeration of pre-existing anxiety and material melancholies for the user to reflect on.
Hi, so my name's Matt, and I'm the lab tech at the Critical Media Lab, and my job is to provide technical support and consultation for all the projects, some of which you've seen here, that are going on in the lab, and as well to perform whatever maintenance and be a representative for the space. So I primarily support students in the CML as they build objects to think with, like you've seen here. And these objects fulfill the lab's motto, which is technology investigating technology. So students often experiment and tinker and create independently, but I'm available to discuss the technical feasibility of their ideas, to point them in the right direction, or to work side by side with them to debug circuits and code. So this role has provided me with the technician's perspective on the creator-technician relationship, and I'd like to share some of those thoughts with you today and raise some open questions with you about the nature of this interaction. So first, a bit about myself and my background. I'm actually a graduate student in the Department of Mechanical and Mechatronics Engineering at the University of Waterloo. So I'm the odd duck out here. I'm not in digital humanities, really. My research is in robotics, so specifically physical human-robot interaction, looking at feedback control strategies to improve haptic transparency. So my research asks questions such as, how do we better control robots when they're interacting with humans, and how do we model the coupled dynamics and the changed physics of a human and robot working together, and how do we use this model to our advantage. So in my past, I spent a summer doing avionics repair, essentially doing precision soldering on autopilots and weather radar units for aircraft. And so I have some thoughts, Darren, on some of this soldering technique and whether hot melt should be used as strain relief. And I've worked for a couple years in the consumer electronics industry, doing a lot of prototyping with 3D printers and working with Arduinos and stuff. So I've really helped provide a lot for the lab to be critical about. So I feel like a bit of a double agent here, representing the CML. So my goal as a lab technician, a master of certain techniques, is to make as much of this knowledge and skill that I've acquired through my experience available to support the creative endeavors of students in the lab. But in doing this, the lines between consultation and collaboration can quickly blur. So this raises questions of artistic integrity and, in our case at the lab, potentially academic integrity as well. The latter can be addressed through the university's policies, and so those offer some guidelines for us to follow. But when it comes to artistic integrity, not so much. We're kind of left to our own devices. There's no one who we can look to understand how this relationship should work. So there are certainly people who would claim that the artist or creator should be solely responsible for all of the technical labor involved in whatever project that they work on. So I ask questions such as, to what extent can the technician provide assistance? Should the creator be expected to take on all of the technical labor? Should the lab tech even exist at all? And so I make such a strong distinction here between the artist and the technician because of the orthogonality that I see between the expertise of myself and as the students and creators. So I see them as authors of a creative ideal, critical media theorists who are imagining these radical objects to think with, and I see myself as just a tool, a human technique, as Grant mentioned this morning. So my biggest concern about being involved with any of these projects is the bias that I inevitably bring to any of these interactions for even the smallest technical contribution. So as someone with next to no formal humanities education, really only enough to satisfy the breadth requirements of an Ontario engineering undergraduate degree, which is like 2 courses, like Psych 101 and something else. I'm arguably one of the worst people in the world to be influencing the designs of these theoretically grounded critical media projects. And so in some situations, I may play a fundamental role in the creator's understanding of their own work by elaborating on certain underlying technical details while glossing over others. So this morning, Kristen mentioned that she found it interesting comparing what she expected to be challenging about making the virtual arcade compared to what Matt from Marshall said was actually the tough parts. And so clearly, creating artifacts and understanding them technically shapes how we think about them. And so as a mediator of that, I'm responsible for these great ideas, that not taking credit, but saying that I helped to shape these ideas for better or for worse. And so often, I'm one of the first people to hear about a student's concept for a digital media project, maybe even before a supervisor or an instructor. And my reaction, which can often come from a place of technical excitement, can have a significant impact on their still forming ideas. So the technician holds this sort of technical authority, which I found can quickly spill over into the appearance of artistic or creative authority, and it can tend to pollute the creator's original intent, despite my best intentions and despite my limited stake in the work, ultimately. So despite the risk of tainting the project, the lab tech, of course, brings a few benefits to the table. One of those is it allows for an increased scope and depth of technical projects that can be created. So the technical accessibility is increased. So with the right resources and technical mentorship, students in the lab can be more ambitious, and they can enjoy more creative freedom imagining the objects to think with that they can ultimately create. So knowing that technical support, which is a sort of offloading of technical labor, is available, allows them to create things that they otherwise might not. A technician can also help to produce a more robust work in shorter time. So Darren this morning talked about spending the past couple years learning relearning oscilloscopes, multimeters, going back to 8th grade stuff. The XDM students, the experimental digital media students, it's a one-year program, so they don't necessarily have that time where they can invest and truly be technical masters like Darren. So, or technical amateurs like Darren. So this raises the question, is there more merit in a smaller, simpler project done by yourself or a more robust project done in collaboration with someone like myself? So students in the CML are of course engaging in the research creation process, like Marcel mentioned earlier, the slide where you make things and then you think about them and write about them and refine your ideas as you go. So according to this philosophy, the process of the creation is just as valuable as the final result. And so the misunderstandings of the technology, the failures and the mistakes that can happen without a technician can be just as interesting as whatever final project or final product they come up with. So the creator-technician partnership in the research creation paradigm has to maximize both the technical accessibility so they can make these really cool projects, but making sure that my own involvement is actually minimized. So technical labor performed by a technician, such as curating tutorials and resources, offering workshops, outside of the context of a specific project can help keep projects accessible to students with different technical backgrounds, but at the same time, too much of this help runs the risk of starving the creation process of the opportunities for insight that make it so valuable in the first place. So as all of us are digital scholars and critical makers, we will likely play the role of technician to some degree as we share our knowledge with others while not being direct stakeholders in a project ourselves. So it's important to reflect on the nature of the creator-technician partnership and to encourage critical thinking throughout the technical process and to find the appropriate balance between the technical influence and the artistic intent.
Hey everyone, so my name's Andy, and I'm a first-year master's student in the Experimental Digital Media program. So I'm going to be kind of picking up where Jason left off with physical practices. He did a really good job of demonstrating how there's this tight relationship between the physical practices that people engage with, the tools they use, and then these underlying notions of like selfhood or masculinity that come from but then grow through these practices. So I'm going to be talking about Olympic weightlifting in 3 words: amateur, technique, and intensity. It's funny sometimes in my reading when you come across like a word like amateur, technique, or intensity that figures both in the primary text of something, you know, like an instructional strength book, but also that comes across in like a theorist's concept of technique. So what is Olympic weightlifting? Well, if you're not familiar with it, it's distinct from other so-called strength sports like powerlifting, strongman, CrossFit, etc., where these 2 wonderfully named exercises called snatch and the clean and jerk, in which a barbell, which is itself a tool, you know, that's been optimized and designed to enable the maximum amount of load to be carried, are lifted rapidly off the ground. And Olympic weightlifters are obsessed with technique. It's everything. You can see on the left, this is a world champion, Liu Xiaojun, who's performing a snatch, and just a fan, not even his coach, has tracked the path of the barbell in the right-hand video and uploaded it and calculated the height and the velocity. So you can see there's an obsession with technique in this vertical, completely upward movement of the bar. So we might compare this to something like Jacques Ellul's notion of technical efficiency, which is a kind of mechanization of the human being and an effort to, lubricate the processes so that, almost the human disappears in a sense. And I think there's actually some interesting tension between this kind of practice and whether or not it represents, that type of mechanical efficiency, depending on how you look at both the representation of this practice in the Olympics or a competition versus the actual practice of it in a gym hall. For example, in the Olympics, there are 3 attempts in each exercise, and often, the desired goal is to make it look effortless, to almost become mechanical. But there's still, a lot of drama and emotion throughout the event as lifters fail or incur injuries. And similarly, this hour or so, this moment in which the mechanization is perfected doesn't necessarily reflect the hours or years of intense training and pain. So why would somebody go through that? And as this practice gets more popular to a general population, why would somebody who's not, professional, who's been kind of, either born or developed through a state system or, a natural athlete, why would an average or, just a hobbyist go about this? So that brings us to the notion of the amateur athlete. So I'm looking at what Bernard Stiegler says about the amateur. He says the amateur is the name given to someone who loves works or who realizes him or herself in traversing such works. Now, Stiegler isn't referring to weightlifting. He's talking about technology, poems, writing, those sorts of things, but I think the emphasis on love or passion is what maintains the amateur here. Stiegler, importantly, opposes the amateur to the figure of the consumer. Amateur gives taste, as amateur taste gives the percept by which it is constituted, it participates in what it desires and is thereby individuated. To love is to contribute to the being and or the becoming of that which is loved. So I think taste is a really important notion here, and it's really this taste or this desire for an aesthetic experience of the barbell and speed that are really motivating the weightlifter. This is why I would resist understanding it as a complete mechanization, because there's still this primary sort of lust for this sensory experience that maintains the amateur. Really interestingly, Stiegler also writes that the amateur resists this double dissociation, and does so because of the time of the amateur is that which resists the dissociation of the time of life into work and the time of leisure. So he's talking about, he gives the example of hackers who, they're essentially performing a type of labor or work, but it doesn't figure either into production or consumption. It's this kind of melange of both, and I think a hobby that's as intense as weightlifting makes us question these categories as well. It's funnily enough, trainers often refer to what they're performing as a type of work, whether they're performing technique work, strength work, speed work, mobility work, etc. These are all figured as work. So I would just step aside to note that it's interesting how the category of like Instagram fitness or digital media complicates this category, the amateur. As somebody who's not necessarily professionalized in their technique or their skill can still become a professional or monetize their existence online through techniques rather than lifting but of promotion. So something like Instagram thrusts us into this broader community where you can contact the professional and engage with them and learn from them. It also exposes you to actually what is kind of more mechanized, which is like the selling of supplements or the instant gratification of technological solutions. So I think the amateur helps us suggest what is at stake here. It's actually, in thinking about it as a love or a passion, it's more affirmative than some of the other conceptions we might have of why people are devoted to physical culture. But I'm going to kind of go back to Jason's question here in my third term, which is intensity. So in weightlifting and in physical training in general, intensity is one of the factors that you manipulate in your training. So the intensity is a measure of poundage as a percentage of what you can actually perform. So for example, if I lift 90 pounds, that's 90% of my max, which would be 100 pounds. And this is a factor with frequency, or in other words, how often you lift, the number of sets and the number of repetitions, which constitutes the total volume. So really in weightlifting, there's always this striving to increase intensity. I'm comparing this in the bottom left to Plato's allegory of the cave. There's this upward movement towards the sun. And for Plato, physical development was obviously very important, equally as important as mental development towards this goal of perfection. The middle image here is from Mark Ripto's Starting Strength with It, which is a canonical book in strength training, most known for getting people to put on a lot of muscle really quickly, so it appeals to a lot of young men. And you can see the main line there is strength performance as measured by intensity. So over the years, from 1 to however many years, a trainee develops by how much they can lift. And this is obviously how not only the Olympics works, but general, masculine bro culture. You have to grow from an ooze to a freak beast. So, like a lot of us have been mentioning throughout the day, this is tied in a way to electricity. The philosopher Tristan Garcia wrote a book about this called La Vie Intense, in which he traces the history of electricity to this development of the ethics of intensity. So, for Tristan, he diagnoses phenomenon like CrossFit or weightlifting, or the experience of intense experience under drugs, as this striving for more of the same, or intensity. So growing not always with respect to the past, to a measurement of the past self. So these are just some thoughts I've had, but I think it's important to just note the like the specificity that arises from the particular tool or site of analysis. So this type of Olympic weightlifting presents itself as a slightly different culture in practice, with different underlying assumptions than, for example, the progress that Jason was talking about. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Phil, and I'm a PhD candidate at Waterloo. And when I first came into the program, it was specifically just going to be like literature kind of review, and then it slowly grew into media, into my media interests. And then I started using the sort of the lab, the critical media lab, for my dissertation. My dissertation's research is located at the intersections of 20th century American literature, media, and autobiography. My dissertation, this is a rough sketch, compares modern cinema literature and radio with later postmodern literature and the early internet of the 80s and 90s. Specifically, I take Gertrude Stein's engagement with radio and connect her ideas of radio with the autobiographical orality of her work that her work elicits from readers. And I compare this with David Foster Wallace's work and the autobiographical narratives about mental health and addiction that emerge on online infinite jest reading group blogs. It's an odd pairing, I admit, but a lot of fun that reveals American dreamy and dashed hopes of mass media's democratic potential. For my dissertation, I created 2 research creation projects. With Stephen Trothan, we retrofitted a radio that played recordings of collaborators reading from Stein's Everybody's Autobiography. We call this project Everybody's Autobiography. And you can watch the video on YouTube. You just look up the title, and it's basically like a fire log thing. So it goes for about an hour. It doesn't showcase the whole project. But yeah, so feel free to go and listen to it afterwards. And I also organized my own online infinite jest reading group blog called Poor Yorick's Summer, to understand sort of the affect of participating and reading with others and blogging with others. So today, however, I will be talking about none of those things. I will be talking about the Game Boy camera, which results from my recent research interests moving forward in autobiography and video games, and the research on photography that I'm doing currently for Dr. Amy Morrison. So, the ritual of photography. When Nintendo's Game Boy camera launched in North America in 1998, the marketing campaign referred to the Game Boy camera's photographic functionality as photography. The portmanteau wordplay that combines fun and photography highlights the Game Boy camera's integration of play into the act of taking, editing, and printing photographs. The camera is notable for having a front-outward-facing camera and affords users with the ability to incorporate their photos and mini-games to digitally inscribe and edit their photos and to print their photos on sticker paper. The Game Boy camera does more than simply gamify photography, however. Although the marketing and portmanteau of photography suggests that the Game Boy camera is introducing a new way of taking photographs, the idea and functionality of play in relation to photography is not necessarily novel. Rather, the Game Boy camera partakes in a social ritual of photography that integrates play and playfulness into the act of taking, editing, and printing photos. In this paper's media archaeological approach, I connect the Game Boy camera's photography functionality to Kodak's 1900 camera, the Brownie, and Japanese Pirikura photography in the 1990s. Ronald Grimes argues that one possible mood of rituals is the ludic. So although the Game Boy camera is a game, Its ludic approach to photography aligns it with other ludic approaches to photography and reveals what Erke Hotamo calls a topos of photography. Topos are described as, quote, a stereotypical formula evoked over and over again in different guises and for various purposes, end quote. For me, a topos study can identify neglected or suppressed rituals around certain media. While such photographic rituals like family photography and elementary class photos are social, situating the Game Boy camera, the Brownie, and Pura Kura photography together illuminates the ritual of playing with photography amongst people for building social bonds. Additionally, situating these photographic media troubles Johann Huizinga's argument that play transports the participants to another world. He writes, quote, the ritual act has all the formal and essential characteristics of play, particularly insofar as it transports the participants to another world, end quote. Juxtaposing the emergence of Kodak in the early 1900s and Japanese Purakura photography in the 1990s reveals that the Game Boy camera's ludic engagement with photography blurs the other world of play with the world of the player and acts as an autobiographical engagement that molds identity and social relationships. In 1900, Kodak introduced the Brownie. The Brownie was Kodak's first affordable and inexpensive camera, sold at $1, in contrast to the earlier 1888 Kodak camera that was priced at $25. Additionally, Jill Pasternak details that Kodak, quote, separated the act of photographing from the knowledge of turning exposures into pictures. In so doing, George Eastman spawned snapshot photography, the practice of picture taking involving no professional, artistic, or aesthetic aspiration, end quote. The Brownie's financial and technical accessibility made the act of photography available to the mass public and no longer a ritual of the elite or middle class. Yet Pasternak importantly notes in a brief aside that Brownie's packaging introduced the Brownie as a toy for children. More than just the packaging, you could see in these figures that the camera is advertised as a toy for children. The ads in Cosmopolitan, Youth Companion, Ladies' Home Journal, and McClure's present the snapshot photography of the Brownie as so simple to use, it could be, quote, operated by any schoolboy or girl. But more importantly, and in connection to the photography of Game Boy camera, the practice of picture taking that involves no professional, artistic, or aesthetic inspiration is described as fun in the Brownie ads and is depicted as playful. The majority of the ads depict children playing, playfully toying around with the camera, and the written portion of some ads describes the Brownie as such. Quote, there is fun for the young folks with a Brownie camera, and it's fun that amounts to something too. There's education as well as amusement in photography, end quote. The educative value of photographs is ambiguous, yet the ad suggests that photography's amusement encourages children to interact with and learn about the world and others. A screenshot from the Game Boy camera ad resonates with the Snow Plays Brownie ad, in which the act of playing being photographed is depicted. Indeed, the Game Boy camera transports the individual being photographed into the Game Boy camera. But by simultaneously displaying the play in the real world and the act of photographing, both of these ads situate fun and photography as engagement and activity with the world and others around them. There is some form of transportation here, though lines between the real world and another world are blurred. While the evidence of the Kodak's Brownie's ritual of play and photography is primarily located in ads, Japanese Purakura photography actualizes the ritual of play in photography. Founded by Atlas in 1995 and later joined with Sega Enterprises a couple of months later, Purakura is short for Parento Kuragu, which translates to print club in English. Purakura photography is photo booth photography that affords the digital manipulation of photographs that users can then print out and create photo albums that act as a record of social capital. Metz Sandy argues that, quote, all points towards regarding Purakura photography much more as activity or a doing than as images related to a nostalgic freezing or mummification of a moment that has been. And here she's talking about what Roland Barthes talked about in Camera Lucida. Instead of preserving memories, the social activity of Purakura photography creates social bonds in a weekly sometimes daily ritual. The constraint of the Game Boy camera's limited space and the afforance of the printing capabilities present photography also as a ritualized activity rather than a means of creating and preserving memories. Further, the fact that the Game Boy camera is a Game Boy cartridge is a medium-specific connotation, that the Game Boy camera is a game, an activity, something that is a doing. Juxtaposing Purakura photography with the Game Boy camera illuminates Sandby's argument that photographs are material and social objects, objects that, quote, mold and create identity and social relations between people, end quote. The parallels between the Purakura photography and the Game Boy camera are uncanny. And so far in my research, there has been that the Game Boy camera has been inspired by Purakura photography is a likely possibility, but so far in my research, I haven't come across anyone that's explored this idea. So although Joanne Gard Hansen does not mention play, the ritual of play in photography conveys what she calls friendship photography and mobile and digital photography. Gard Hansen argues, quote, friendship photography expands and contracts the intimacy of the family well beyond personal and collective memory and remembering. It seeks to make an emotional connection in the present, establish a social tie, perform intimacy and joint memory as simultaneously offline and online, end quote. Yet the ritual of play in photography and the emphasis on photography as an activity that creates social bonds has always been a part of photography. Moreover, while photography and social practices in relation to photography existed well before Kodak, this paper demonstrates that perhaps cheaper, more accessible forms of photography lend to the playfulness of photography, an activity that is emotionally connected to the present, then invested in creating memories for the future. So thank you.
All right, so I want to thank all these people for courageously presenting their work. Some of it's still in progress. I'm going to do this really quick, actually. I have a very brief presentation on the digital abstinence stuff, and just to tell you where it's coming from, what the Yonder thing is all about, etc. So this is a project, performance piece that I did at Nuit Blanche, Toronto, the Carnival of the Future in Phoenix, Arizona, and a few other places where I dress up as a street preacher. That's not my real hair. I'm sure you're wondering. And we would preach the analog word, and as people were entering into an event, lock their devices away in this disused Catholic tabernacle that I got on eBay. And basically like a coat check, they'd come back after they were done in an unmediated fashion at the event, come back, we give them their device back, spritz it with holy spray, which is screen cleaner, and then they would confess their digital sins, and we'd absolve them of their digital sins, and they'd go away. So that's the Digital Tabernacle project. Here's some phones that we got from drunk people at an event. And there's the very happy ministers of the Digital Tabernacle. While we were doing this, we had we basically retrofitted these life logging cameras with cross arms that we wore the whole time. So while we were professing digital abstinence, we're recording everything and uploading it. Every 30 seconds, we take a photo of people, of whoever was there, and upload it. So I've audio recorded hundreds of digital sins. I don't have time to go through all of these, but what I'll say is that people never hesitate. I never have to explain what a digital sin is. I don't even know what it is. This isn't some kind of Catholic campaign. I have no idea what a digital sin is, but people have attached, the point is to show that people have attached moral values to their technological habits, and this is a way of getting at that idea by having them confess these. And I've organized these into, so far I noticed, two different types of digital sins. One are just plain old conventional sins like gluttony, sloth, and whatever, that digital media facilitates. And the other type is sins against technology, like I created a Twitter account and I never used it, or I killed Facebook, or I text in full sentences, whatever. Okay, so there have been a lot of other confessions of digital sins recently. People like Lauren Brichter, who invented the pull to refresh action, who's having an existential crisis. James Willis at Google, who's saying it's the most standardized form of attentional control in history. Chamath Palihapitiya, who's saying, I feel tremendous guilt for what he did at Facebook. Sean Parker, founding president of Facebook, God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. He's talking about smartphones in general. And then, of course, Tristan Harris, St. Tristan of Mountain View, I like to call him, who said, Hippocratic oath for software designers would stop the exploitation of people's psychological vulnerabilities. So vulnerability is a key word I want to keep in mind. And that's where this research is kind of all headed there's an icon of St. Tristan, which inspired me to write an article about him in the Globe and Mail, if you want to read that. And we already heard about this. He started the Center for Humane Technology to assist the poor people who are suffering from the attention crisis. All right. So keeping ritual in mind, there are already rituals of digital abstinence out there. So Camp Grounded, if you look at the series of activities that Camp Grounded offers, just look at it. You'll know what I'm getting at. And even the National Day of Unplugging through the Sabbath Manifesto people, they got an artist to develop this sleeping bag for a phone, which is just a pull string on a little cotton bag. You put your phone in and put it to sleep as a ritual act. And then there's Yonder, which you're all using right now. So I started working with Yonder when they were a San Francisco-based startup a couple years ago. I got them to send me 300 of those cases so we could do experiments with in psychology with the Vision and Attention Lab in psych. So we're actually doing this in classes at the University of Waterloo, large classes, locking away students' devices, well, some of them, to have a control group, and studying their mind wandering and their attentional capacities while they're using these things. What I found throughout the process is my real interest isn't higher education. I'm more interested in schools and in vulnerable groups, so teenagers and kids in grade school. And what I found is there are some teachers using Yonder in the classroom. It's really a lot like the digital tabernacle. It's like, I'm in charge. I own the locking mechanism. I'm going to lock your shit away. You can't touch it. That doesn't work very well for kids in school, especially teenagers, as you might imagine. But they are a vulnerable group, and we're doing things like my son's school. It's just a public school in Kitchener, Ontario, and every kid in grade 9 gets a Chromebook. They all get a Chromebook, and they get to keep it for the duration of their high school careers. And there's no one asking questions about what Google's doing with all the data that they're gathering from these Chromebooks, and they are gathering data that they've admitted it. So anyway, stuff is happening. I'm not trying to be paranoid about this, but the whole point is that this is a vulnerable group of people, and they're certainly subject to captology. I could go on about BJ Fogg and his persuasive technology lab, but I won't. It's in the Globe article if you want to read it. I could read this quote by Bernard Stiegler about attention economies, but I won't. So yeah, captology used to design interfaces as well as slot machines and coming to a child near you. So when I go into schools, I never thought this digital abstinence weird performance would lead me to go into high schools and talk about, especially Catholic schools, about digital abstinence, which is where I started because it was an easy sell. But I go in, I talk to students, I explain to them what a resistor does, and I'm like, if you attach an LED light to a 9-volt battery and just put the leads on the battery, what's going to happen? And some of them guess, it'll light up, or it'll not blow up, but it'll burn out really quick. Say, but if you put a resistor in there, it'll allow that bulb to glow bright and last a long time. And that's kind of like your brain. So we want to give you a resistor case. This is my pitch. I actually do this shit. We're going to have you make something on your own. They never get that joke. We're going to have you, this is my wife said, that logo, oh yeah, Roman Catholic. Perfect. So by having them make something, by engaging in this kind of precarious embodied act of using a hammer, which is crazy. These guys did it with me with 250 students in one school. Use a hammer to basically knock holes into which you're going to insert these rivets and make this thing on your own and while you're making this thing, discuss your digital usage habits. And then the students bring it to class and they have it in class. It has this really loud Velcro enclosure, and that's the key. Is that it's like the Zen bowstring. It's not too tight, not too loose. It's not a lockdown device. It's a device they make themselves with a loud Velcro enclosure. If they want to open it in class, they can, but everyone's going to know. So basically, the kits that we're giving you is to have you make one of these things. If you want, you got to use hammers. I don't take responsibility if you smash your finger, get a sliver. Camden does. Rutgers does. But so that's the idea. And the kit comes with a set of cards. I get to use all these stupid words like thinkering and presence and stuff in the marketing of this, which is great. So presence isn't a stupid word, but I think, yeah, if you look at the webpage, you'll see what I'm talking about. But each of these materials is basically inspired a card, and teachers are using these to teach classes. Like the fabric that I chose comes from recycled water bottles from Haiti through a fair trade agreement that the fabric company has. Students, you know, the rivets has some information about women in the tech force, or ask questions about Rosie the Riveter, women in the tech force, stuff like that. There's some stuff like comes from UC Parika that gets filtered down into a 3-question card about where a resistor comes from, stuff like that. Here's a bunch of students at St. Mary's School in Kitchener, Ontario, who have made their resistor cases in a proper shop. We don't have a proper shop. We have some wood boards at the back. So you're going to have to pound your nails using the wood boards. These guys will facilitate it. Resistor case, make attention. There's the website. There's an article I wrote about it in The Atlantic if you want to look at that. There's a website called digitalabstinence.org that Jason's worked on quite a bit. You can read articles related to the whole topic. This is Caroline Webb, author of How to Have a Good Day, who made a resistor case and brought it on her book tour, which I think is hilarious. Like, resistor case meets self-help book somehow. It's pretty bizarre. And this is the most bizarre thing. This is Ronald Grimes. I met with him last week, and he showed me, he didn't know anything about resistor case, but he had somehow unwittingly made his own 2 years ago out of leather and Velcro, which kind of freaked me out. But you look at him, he's kind of scary as hell anyway. I'm just going to leave you with one last quote. I won't read John Durham Peters, but these are the epigraphs to the book I'm working on now. Stupidity could refer not simply to a lack of knowledge, but to the limits of certain forms of knowing, certain ways of inhabiting structures of knowing. That's from Jack Halberstam, The Queer Art of Failure. It's supposed to inspire you to use a hammer right now. Yeah. And then this last thing, that first chapter from the book, I talk about the term crapentry. So here's a 3-legged table I made in my living room. It's very dangerous. But it's the whole idea is not to be afraid to fail and to take embodied risks that are controlled. I think that's it.